Greetings, fellow travelers. Welcome to the 37th level of the RPG Cave. I am one of your hosts, the level 99 human archmage, Ryan Turford, and I'm joined, as always, by the level 99 elf medic, Mr. Garret Bland. Garret, how are you doing this lovely, lovely Monday evening? Probably second cup of coffee-less, right?
Actually, yes. I had 2 lattes today. It was pretty good. But no drink on me right now. I am drinked out. No, yeah. Sorry, guys.
What are you gonna do when we get like an hour into this riveting conversation, Garret? You're gonna have this parched throat and you're not gonna be able to speak. Like, what are you gonna do then?
I'm gonna be dehydrated. I don't know what's gonna happen. We'll see when we get there, though.
God, the Schick Hydropot would be like so disappointed in you right now, Garret. Let me tell you what. But anyways, this is the RPG Cave where we talk about RPGs all the time, except for when the Schick Hydropot decides to invade our world. So let's clear the dungeon of these pesky mobs, of course. So folks at home, if you want to support this show, there's a number of awesome ways to do that. Number one, subscribe to us on your podcast feed of choice. We're on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, Spotify. We're on all the places you find podcasts. So check us out there. Maybe you leave a little rating on Spotify or Apple Podcasts if you're listening there. Maybe leave an Apple Podcast review. Give us 5 stars over there. All that stuff helps the show get discovered. Also, if you want to see our beautiful faces every single week, head over to YouTube, youtube.com/Capri. We put up a video version of the show over there. And of course, like, subscribe, share, binge, ding, 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 ring that bell. Because again, that's what people tell you to do on YouTube. And again, it helps the channel. And then last but not least, of course, if you want to support the show and you want the show a little bit early, head over to Patreon, patreon.com/Capri. Get early access to this and all of our shows, as well as some exclusive content over there. So go ahead and check this out. Now, Garret, before we get into today's topic, we of course put out questions this week for the show, but we got this slightly irate response from one Sean Capri.
Never heard of him.
I feel like we need to tackle this before we get into the big topic. So Sean Capri, over on Sean Capri, asked the question, "Hey, I have a question. How do you sleep at night after broadcasting such slander against Fire Emblem Fates on the last episode? Follow-up question, how can you expect the audience to trust you after the slander you broadcasted about Fire Emblem?" So I just want the record to show, Sean, that we gave 2 of the 3 Fire Emblem Fates games an S rank and an A rank. So I don't know where the slander is. Besides, I guess maybe you're angry that we didn't like Birthright, but Birthright's just too easy, man. And it's definitely on
Birthright's just okay. Yeah. It's okay.
Like if you're arguing that it's more than okay, I think you're maybe on the wrong side of history with this one. At least in comparison to all the other Fire Emblem games. Because again, when we were kind of putting that together, and we said this on the episode too, it was like, in comparison to the other games on that list, where does Fire Emblem Fates Birthright, fit on that list? And for me, it definitely is a C ranking where it's like, it's fine. It exists, but is it better than...
And you could play it?
But is it better than, Bravely Default on the B tier? No, of course it's not. So that's why it belongs on the C tier. That's just how I feel about it.
I totally agree with you. And how do you sleep at night? Sean, I sleep just fine. Yeah. Like that Fire Emblem, like if you give me a Fire Emblem like tier list, that would be the same type of list I would make. Birthright is just kind of... I mean, it's great. I mean, I'm sure if you get into it, it's great, but like, is it compared to like Fire Emblem Awakening?
Yeah.
And then, Fire Emblem Shadow of Valencia. I love that personally, like a lot more. So sorry, bud. Got to put you down somewhere, Sean.
Yeah.
Sorry.
It's all good. But yeah, we had to read that, of course, after last week's show. But although we had like some fun responses to that show, so I want to say thanks to everyone who actually let us know in the Discord that they actually liked that episode, and that was a lot of fun to do. And you can expect maybe we do more of that stuff in the future because
for sure,
I think I like doing tier lists; they're fun. So there we go. Plus, the internet likes them, Garret, and that's all we care about. But enough about tier lists and all that junk. Let's read from the sacred texts because it's time to talk about today's topic. And today's topic is going to be a fun one, folks, because we're going to talk about what could possibly be the oldest company that we've talked about on this entire run of company shows that we've done. We're talking about Nihon Falcom today, and we're going to just go straight into fun facts because, Garret, you've lined up the fun facts this week. So hit me with the fun facts, my friend.
Yes, dude. Did you know about Nihon Falcom, like the history behind this studio beforehand? Like, I kind of knew they were like one of those like, I wouldn't say like super high famous or whatever studio, but like kind of behind the scenes, still really in Japan culture. It's like, so I'm just curious, Ryan, did you know, like when I was searching up stuff about Nihon Falcom, I was just like blown away. So Ryan, did you know about all of this history?
I didn't know about everything. I knew about some stuff because I've actually played, some of their, NES games, for example, because cool. Nihon Falcom actually did a lot of like NES era games. They also did a lot of stuff for TurboGrafx 16. So if you know anything about the TurboGrafx 16, they did a lot of games there, which I'm sure we're going to get into. But then they also did a lot of stuff that didn't come out here as well. So I mean, that's a lot of the stuff that Japanese only. That's a lot of the stuff that I just don't know about. But Falcom's a name that I've known about for years, but it's just one of those things where I never really did like a historical deep dive on them before. So
yes, so I did a deep dive into their history, and let me tell you guys, I was actually surprised that they're kind of like one of probably the oldest video game companies ever, like to really start. This company was founded in March 1981 by Masayuki Kato, making them one of the most oldest active video game companies. And so the company, basically when they were starting out, they had the advantage of like pixel art. So they had a lot of, definitely in relation to just the art style, but also as time progressed, they really focused more on story than graphics themselves. That's why they're a small group of people. Still, they're still at around, as of 2019, 62 employees. They were founded in 1981 and they're still pretty small. Yeah. They don't put like a lot of time into graphics, but more geared towards story into their JRPGs. And so that's what their founder said, is like when we get a writer that knows a lot of good stories and able to build knowledge over time. And that is kind of the legacy of Nihon Falcom. You're going to hear a lot about these games. They're going to be spin-offs. They're going to be sequels from one series to the next. Make them, they're pretty much a legend in terms of just story writing and just connections between their games.
Which is interesting to hear too, because like most game companies back then weren't even thinking about stories in games, because 1981 was when we had, games on Atari 2600 where that console wasn't powerful enough to really tell compelling stories. Right. Like you didn't really have anything like that. You had some RPGs on that console, like not Dragon Quest. It's like
like roguelike. You know, you got Rogue.
That's true.
Basically.
Yeah, you had stuff like Treasure Master and a bunch of other stuff like Sword Quest, which there's a really funny story attached to Sword Quest and kind of the contest that went ahead along with that. But there was stuff like that on the Atari, but there was nothing that was really like telling stories or anything like that. Right. In fact, like the very first game I ever remember having like cinematics in it and telling a story in a video game was Ninja Gaiden on the NES, because it had these like cinematics in the game with, text and everything. The characters were talking to each other, and it was really trying to tell you the story about this, ancient demon statue and all this other stuff that was going on. So yeah, it's really interesting to hear that a company was so forward thinking about the story. I think that's really interesting.
For sure. Yeah. So I was trying to go through a little bit of the beginning of their games, and it looks like they were ports of some kind. I saw one game named Private Stripper. I'm just like, they were definitely in like the porting scene or just trying to make whatever quick buck. But they mainly focus, as you said, on Atari, but they mainly focus on PC. PC 8801 is like one of their primary systems when they were developing their games. Basically they became one of the most influential Japanese video game companies in that era, along with Square and Enix. Pretty darn close to that. But what really set them on the map, really the first kind of game that's like a template for action RPGs in general, is this role-playing game that they made in 1983 for the PC 8801 called Panorama To in Japanese, but also it's called Panorama Island. Is that, yes. Created by Yoshio Kiya, who went on to create the other future franchises that we're going to talk about. And so basically this game was, it was a hex grid. It was kind of a dungeon crawl like RPG, but what really set it apart was the real time combat that was in this game that was separate from the other turn-based or other kind of dungeon crawling type of games that were there at the time. And so this is what Falcom was being later known for, is their action RPG formula. So Panorama Island. Ryan, have you ever heard of this game? Have you ever?
It's a Japanese only PC game, Garret. It's one that's kind of stayed out of my wheelhouse. So yeah, I didn't really look up much info about this one. How does this one play anyways? Do you know?
I kind of try to look into it in the gameplay. It is like a hex grid in a sense. So this still has a little bit of like kind of turn-based combat involved, but it is real time. Okay. And then there's also like introduced like real-time mechanics such as sci-fi elements, and then also like a persistent open world with day-night cycle and survival mechanics.
Jesus.
It's one of the first games that have dialogue with NPCs. You're able to have choices in between, like, giving them money or like shooting them or anything along the lines of that. Like, this is one of the first games that had those systems in there. And it's arguably probably the template going forward what an action RPG is. When a developer was making a game that wants to be an action RPG, they go back to this game, Panorama Island. Yeah,
it sounds like they go between that or something like Gauntlet at the time, where Gauntlet, yes, is more of an arcade game, but it was also an action RPG, but it was very much like what inspired stuff like Diablo, like a dungeon crawling game, versus something like this, which more inspired, stuff like Crystalis or a bunch of other, action RPGs that came out around this time era, like stuff like Popful Mail and other games like that. So yeah, that's interesting.
So yeah, that was their like first big hit, was this Panorama Island. Of course, yes, Japan only. But then they went on to create kind of an evolution from that game, their legendary franchises. And I'm going to go through 3 of them. There's more, and there's a ton of spinoffs. Let me tell you, when I was going through the list, Ryan, like it could be more than Square Enix, Final Fantasy. It could be more than Dragon, like Square Enix, the company in general, with Dragon Quest and Final Fantasy. It's like no joke how many games
only company that beat this was From Software. When we talked about that a few weeks ago.
Yeah.
Because if you don't remember, it was like almost like 70 games.
Yeah, they went through quite a bit. All right, so the 3 flagship franchises that we're going to talk about first is Dragon Slayer series that spurred off these other 2 franchises, The Legend of Heroes and the E series. So the original Dragon Slayer was responsible for setting the template. Again, like it was another evolution from Panorama Tower Island of an action RPG. It kind of like evolution, like from, like dungeon crawling or turn-based, like medieval-like games, and then like transferred into an action RPG. It spawned multiple sequels and iterations. It released in 1984. And there, I forgot. I didn't count how many Dragon Slayer games there are, but I will go through, hand select a few of them that actually spurred in the other franchises. And the latest one that's really connected to the Dragon Slayer series you may have heard of is Tokyo Xanadu.
Okay.
Yeah, that one was a spinoff from Dragon Slayer 2 Xanadu. And Xanadu is its own little kind of sub-series as well. And so, yeah, in contrast to earlier roguelikes, it was a dungeon crawl RPG with entirely real-time action-oriented combat. It featured an in-game map, help with dungeon crawling, and it required item management. Happen one item at a time, and it's an item-based puzzle game that influences legendary franchises like The Legend of Zelda. So, yeah, there you go. Dragon Slayer was a huge hit in Japan, and actually the second one at the time was probably one of the best-selling PC games in Japan. Around 400,000 copies sold for that second game.
Nice. It sounds like they could really like harness the power of the PC, because like one of the reasons why we didn't see a lot of those features that you described in stuff like Zelda or other console releases at the time was just the NES couldn't do a lot of that stuff. Like we saw PC ports of coming to NES all the time with stuff like Hydlide or Ultima, where they essentially had like the PC interface in the NES itself, but like Hydlide, for example, had like a save function and a load function like a PC would, but when you hit the save function in Hydlide, nothing happens because you have to go to a separate option in the menu that says password, and it gives you the password, and then you write that password down, and then you go to load, and then when you select the load command, you then put in the password it gives you. So instead of, writing it to your computer like a game like Dragon Slayer would have done on like the MSX PC, for example, which is the same Japanese computer that the Metal Gear games actually started out on. Instead, you had that's why we didn't see stuff like this on NES. Just because, again, there was so many more limitations to the hardware that just consoles just didn't have versus PCs at the time. And we just didn't, here in North America, PCs gaming wasn't, what it is now. Like people played some games on PC, but like it was a much more niche thing than it is nowadays.
Very niche, yeah.
And that's why for the most part, that's why I compare it so much to console releases, because as someone who grew up during that time frame, like that's what we were thinking about. That's what was on the top of our minds were console games, because, again, most of us didn't play games on PC on like our 5.5-inch floppy disks or whatever, especially games like this. That's why most of these stayed in Japan, because it's weird to see that contrast where it was almost like the reverse, where in Japan, like I think PC gaming was just so much more popular earlier on versus consoles were here anyways. So.
Yeah, definitely. And you mentioned Hydlide, and they do mention a lot that that's one of their major competitors in the RPG field was that company in that game. Did you ever play this series, any of its games? Because I know it's been ported to the Sega Master System and other Sega systems, and also in some Nintendo, and I'm not sure about PlayStation. I think they kind of died down until around that time. But I'm interested. Do you have any history with the Dragon Slayer series?
Literally none. I think out of all the 3 series on here, that's the one I just haven't played any of them because of the kind of the accessibility thing. For example, Sega Master System, I didn't even have the ability to play Sega Master System games until last year, and I know that's where we also got ports of Ys and some other games, which we'll talk about in a bit. So I know that there have been some ports to those consoles, but because I didn't play them at the time, it's just one of those things where an accessibility thing kind of prevented me from checking a lot of these out. I mean, and to be fair, they've never really been at the top of my list either to check out, because again, it's just one of those things where it's awesome to hear that it's kind of the beginning of the action RPG genre, but at the same time, I've never thought to really seek these out, if that makes any sense, especially because these mostly are more popular in Japan versus North America.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, for the most part. And I even never really heard of Dragon Slayer series, so that's telling that it wasn't that really popular with us or here in the North America. I am interested to hear other people if they ever played this series, because it is definitely like kind of the birth of these other franchises we're going to be talking about. And so the next one I would like to get into, Ryan, is the Ys series.
Yes.
So the first installment is in 1987 on, again, the PC 8801 in Japan. It was called a lot of things in English, but we'll just go with Ys 1, Ancient Ys Vanished. It came out in Japan only. And then there was some kind of remakes and complete versions of it that came out later in North America.
Well, I was going to say, with that one, like the one that people know the most, probably the version that people probably started with Ys in North America would have been Ys 1 and 2, which was a re-release of the first two games on TurboGrafx. I think that was like the first kind of North American release for that people would know about.
Okay. Yeah, I remember they did some sort of compilation, I guess in the TurboGrafx and also the Sega Master System and stuff like that, right?
Yeah.
And they commonly misspelled it in the English language release as Y''S.
Yep.
I guess some sort of translation issue.
Well, I mean,
the
Y was trying to, own the rest of the title, Garrett. Like they were in possession of it.
Yeah, pretty much. The first time I pronounced this series, I called it Weiss, and I know someone out there in the audience corrected me to Yeast.
Yep.
And so I said, thank you very much and I'm sorry for my embarrassment out there.
Wise. That's such a great name.
Exactly. Right. So what's different about the E series? Well, it kind of featured like more of a top-down perspective of this game. At least that's how it started as, is a top-down perspective in a lot of them. And it features a battle system where you automatically attack, and then when walking to them, the enemies go like kind of bump, It's like kind of goes off the screen, and there's a lot of just kind of reaction to these enemies. I remember playing like East Origin or whatever. It's like every time I get into these battles or whatever, there'd be a group of enemies in the screen, and you're going to need to like bump on the side or the back or whatever. And you have a bunch of different skills and so on and so forth. And so, yeah, that's kind of like birthed the Yeast series itself, is this kind of combat system. And then, of course, its own lore behind it.
Yeah.
But interesting fact about the first game, Ryan, in the Sega Master System version, the game dungeons were flipped horizontally compared to the PC version.
Of course they were.
Because of its limitations.
Yeah, it was like probably limitation of the Master System, which, by the way, for the folks that don't know, especially knowing their older consoles, the Master System was actually more powerful than the NES. So the fact that the Master System, they had to do it for that, like that explains why this game never came to NES. Was it's just like,
right?
It would probably wouldn't have even run on that console. They would have probably made to do take some like serious concessions to even get that on there. And even then, it would probably play at 3 or 4 frames per second, like Hide Glide does on NES, which is just not fun or playable. So
right,
yeah, but
right.
Yeah, that's why the Master System, it's so interesting when looking back on it, because the Master System wasn't super popular, but there's a lot of really good high quality games there that in a way look and sound better a lot of times than NES games do. So it's just cool looking back at that era.
For sure. And then, of course, a lot of sequels came from the Yeast series. Of course, I'm not going to go through all of them, but they basically just number off Yeast 1 all the way through 9. Yep. The most recent one, Yeast 9, Monstrum Nox, that came out in 2019 on the PS4. It's also out on Switch and PC. I've also played Yeast Origin on Vita. And Yeast 8 Lacrimosa of Dana on Switch as well. Both really great games. I like the more recent Yeast games for sure. It has a nice kind of combat to it. I'm sure it reminds you of the Tales series a lot, Ryan. Yeah. Definitely with the action RPG-ness. It's really more akin to those franchises now than it ever was, let's say Yeast Origin, which is kind of like their original formula for the franchise, that top down or kind of like this weird it was like an HD 2D perspective with that game, more or less.
Yeah. They're interesting looking games, and I just want to butt in a little bit. Now, first of all, I just want to do a quick correction before we get people yelling at us in the comments. Yeast 9 actually came out in Japan in 2019.
In Japan.
But it came out last year here in North America, 2021. Because I remember that game coming out.
I was like, wait, why is it 2019?
Yeah.
I was like,
because it took 2 years to get ported, Garrett, of all things, which is actually quite a common occurrence. But also what's interesting about the Ys games as well is that they all follow one story with one main character, and it just continues along. So each game builds upon the story of the last game. So it's one of those series that of RPGs that is harder to get into, admittedly, because you almost feel like you got to go back and play a lot of these games. Now, luckily, for example, Ys 1 and 2 are really accessible if you have a PlayStation Vita, because they're actually got PSP ports and remakes on those on that console, and you can pick up on the digital store, or you can grab the UMD copy for PSP, as well as a lot of the other Ys games did get remakes on other consoles. But it's just one of those things where it's it is tough to ask for a new person to go back and play 9 games if they want to get it caught up with the story for Ys 9 Monstrum Nox, essentially. So that's what I want to say.
Okay, well, when I played East 8, I knew they were kind of connected, but I didn't feel like I needed to go back to previous one. But maybe East 9 does.
I was going to say there's a lot of callbacks that in a lot of the games.
There's callbacks for sure.
That they're just going to fly over your head because you're like, well, okay, sure. But yeah, you're right. It is. You can probably enjoy them without them. I mean, I certainly haven't played all the East games at this point.
Of course.
But I still enjoyed my time playing with some of the East titles. I haven't played East 9 or anything like that, but I played, East 8 and then 1 and 2 on PSP as well, as well as East 7. So I have played some of the games, but not all of them. Like I'm not an East expert, but of the 3 series that we're going to talk about today, it's definitely the one I'm the most familiar with, Garret, as far as the most playtime. Because I played like a lot of these games, and I think they're fun. I think they're good games, and you hit the nail on the head where Ys really was like the template and formula for a lot of other action RPGs at the time. Again, like stuff like Zelda, for example, probably wouldn't exist if it wasn't for the Dragon Slayer games or the Ys games. So it's just interesting, kind of looking back on it.
For sure. Other like memorable games that you could play as well as these Memories of Celceta. I haven't, or Calceta, whatever you call it. I haven't played it, but I know it recently came out on the PS4 and Switch as well. Originally came out on Vita, and I think that's where it really popularized more with our Vita crowd, our Vita audience.
It was a Vita exclusive for a while, but
yes. It's so weird. Oh, man, Nihon Falcom's so weird. They did, like their first, like maybe 60-70% of the series on PC and then like on Windows. And then like it kind of released in the US, but like so many years later. And now they're like releasing games that it released in Japan in like 2008 or something like that. I'm like, what are you doing like with your release schedule? But I guess it's just the logistics behind it and just the interest of the Western audience. I'm glad that they're just getting ported over. Also,
Garret, don't forget, they also made a game for the N-Gage as well. The greatest console of all time, because Xanadu Next came out on the N-Gage, Garret. That we've talked about the N-Gage all the time, like a few times on the show before. And like the time I told Garret about it originally, it just famously blew Garrett's mind that was even a thing that existed. So I had to bring that up because I also have the list of games in front of me, Garret, while we're going through this, and I saw that there. It stuck out to me. I was like, I have to say this. I have to mention it.
Of course. Is there anything on the Swan or the Bandai Namco handheld? The Wonder Swan.
No. Sure they didn't do anything on the Wonder Swan. I'm actually kind of surprised they didn't do anything on like the Turbo Express or the Atari Lynx or anything like that. But no, they mostly stuck with, again, they basically were PC only and basically until the PSP came out. And then that's kind of when they started venturing into consoles. I mean, they did also do, again, some TurboGrafx stuff and then some Super Famicom stuff. But for the most part, they were pretty much just a PC developer, as you kind of alluded to. But then when consoles, I think, caught up to, the technology of the stories they were trying to tell, I think that's when they made the switch to mostly covering consoles and also PC. Again, pretty much all of their games have cut out on PC as well. But just looking at this list, they did 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 PSP games. So if you know the life of the PSP, that's a lot of PSP games for one developer to do in the lifespan of the 5-year lifespan of the PSP. So I think that's pretty cool.
But like, I don't know how many they have made, probably at least, I don't know, like 70, 80 games in these like series or whatever. So even with those like 12 games, like it seems like a lot, but compared to like the rest of they've done, oh my goodness, they've done so many. And it kind of like circles back around too, because you see a lot of their games being ported over to Steam quite a bit. It's like whenever I feel like it's a lot with Japanese developers now. It's like once they release it, it'll for sure be on PlayStation and now be for sure on Steam. And then maybe or not Switch, maybe a special edition a year later or whatever. All right, Ryan. Let's go to the last kind of major series that is kind of Nihon Falcom kind of like covered over. Mm-hmm. And that is the Legend of Heroes franchise. And it actually breaking down really to the Trails series. That's what they call it. And so the original Legend of Heroes game was, of course, a Dragon Slayer game. Yep. It was the 6th entry, and it was the Legend of Heroes 1 and 2. Only the first one came out in English, and they never released the second one.
Yep.
And it came out in Japan in 1989 on the PC 8801. That was their original hardware.
The greatest of all, gaming devices, especially here in North America.
Right. I didn't really look into this game too much because I really want to talk more about these later games. The next 3 games I really haven't heard of. They were called the Gagar trilogy. And it's basically Legend of Heroes 3, 4, and 5. They kind of broke out the Dragon Slayer name and just put 3, 4, and 5 in there. But the English name totally messed up the convention. It was 3 was 5 and 4 was nothing. And then 5 was 6. I don't even know what they were doing in the English convention there. But essentially in Japan, it was 3, 4, and 5. And that was just called the Gagar trilogy. But of course, what became really famous here in the West was the Trails series, which started off with the Legend of Heroes Trails in the Sky. And so that was the first kind of trilogy there. And then the rest of the series up until now has been part of the Trail series, including Trails of Cold Steel, which they kind of just wrapped up, I think. And then Trails, also, there's some other Trails games in there. I don't have them.
Yeah, they got Trails into Reverie, as well as some other ones. Trails to Azure, and then Trails from Zero. Both of those two are actually getting North American releases finally this year, even though they came out, in 2010, 2011 originally. But,
right, they came out so early in Japan.
Yeah, but we're finally getting them this year. So I'm sure we'll be talking about those on the show when they actually come out, because I'm actually excited to play those. But yeah, the Trail series in particular, like Trails of Cold Steel, again, most people who know, Nihon Falcom nowadays, or just know any of these types of games, know the Trails of Cold Steel series, because even though I don't think the following for the Trails of Cold Steel series is super huge, it's a really dedicated fan base that really cares about these games.
Fan base.
Yeah,
for sure, man. I only played Trails of Cold Steel 1, like a good chunk of it on my Vita. I really like it, and of course, part of the legacy of Nihon Falcom, the Trail series is all in one universe.
Yep.
And yeah, I feel like this is way more connected than the E series. Like you gotta play I heard you need to play the Trails of Cold Steel and then Trails in the Sky, then everything else. That's the sequel you should go through. Man, this fan base is really hardcore. And again, I would love to talk to someone that really kind of dug into the lore behind these games. And so I wanted to pick it back up now. I have it on Steam. I have Trails of Cold Steel 1 and 2. And probably the best place to start with the Trails series is Trails of Cold Steel. I would say personally, it's most accessible, and you could probably start out with the first one and be fine. And I would actually prefer it on PC or PS4 just because of the turbo mode that's in there. That kind of speeds up a lot of the dialogue and the scenes and the.
You mean to tell me you don't want people to break out the PS3 version of this, Garrett? Is that what you're trying to say?
No. I'm telling you're saving at least tens of hours if you play it on PS4 or on Steam.
That's a lot.
At least. I heard you skip a bunch once you got turbo mode. You're just fast forwarding a lot and you can grind a lot. But basically, this game, the way I kind of know about it, it's just Trails of Cold Steel. I'm not saying the whole Trails series. It's a band of high school students getting together, kind of more akin to the Persona series, and trying to figure out. They just go through an adventure together. They kind of form bonds and classes together. And what's the major unique part of Trails of Cold Steel is its combat has a bunch of different combos. It kind of goes back into the more turn-based route, at least what I can tell. It's like Monarch, where it's you got a freedom range and you kind of go into certain areas to do kind of like major combos with your other characters themselves. I love the kind of the atmosphere, the scenery. It reminds me a lot of Valkyria Chronicles, where it's medieval, it's old, but also has this kind of futuristic mech.
Yeah, it's something. It's closer to like medieval steampunk kind of thing. Like that's the kind of
medieval steampunk,
because they got trains and
for sure.
all kinds of like steam powered stuff essentially.
And so that's basically it for the Legend of Heroes series. I do have Trails in the Sky as well on Steam. I plan to play all of these games on Steam. But yeah, Ryan, do you have any experience with the Legend of Heroes or the Trails series?
So as I mentioned, I think I've definitely played some of these games, but not a lot. It's definitely one of those series that is one of the bigger holes in my RPG knowledge, especially with Trails of Cold Steel. I was kind of waiting for those games to wrap up before jumping into them. And then I think Trails of Cold Steel 4 came out either at the end of 2020 or early 2021 on it. I can't remember exactly when that came out, but I remember that coming out and be like, oh, it's finally time to play these games. I just haven't gotten around to them because we've had, a lot of stuff to do between then and now. But I've heard nothing but great things about them, and they are on my list eventually. But I know, like, when I start these games, Garrett, I'm gonna have to like make enough time to go through all 4 of them. Essentially, that's kind of like that's kind of the issue going into it. But it's more just trying to plan time, to play all 4 of these games. But again, what I've played, like I've played a lot of the first one. I played, like 20 hours of the first one and really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really fun game. And again, like you said, it's similar to, Persona or Monarch, where it's got like kind of the high school aesthetic. But then it's a little more strategic in its combat in the way that we talked about with Monarch. And the kids go to like a military school. They're not really like, it's not really like a standard high school. It's not like Persona where, you're walking around this town and interacting with the townsfolk and doing other stuff like, or doing a lot of the day-to-day stuff that you do in Persona anyways. It's a different style of game, but also it's also really similar when you look at the history of this versus something like Persona. Cause again, it's an offshoot of another series that is like pretty different from it essentially. So it's just, it's interesting to kind of look at it from that perspective, but that's definitely a series that I do need to get to at some point. But again, from all I played, I know I would enjoy these games, but the time commitment's a lot.
That's the little downside of these Legend of Heroes franchises. Like when you're getting into it, and someone's going to ask which game to get into. It's like, well, you can start with Legend of or Trails of Cold Steel 3 on the Switch if you want to start on the Switch. And it's just like, why didn't you put any more Trails of Cold Steel games earlier on one system? Well, it made it very complicated for sure. These games, as Ryan said, it's not for the newcomers. It's like you got to make sure you have time commitment and make sure that you're willing to just get into it from the beginning, at least like part 1 of a trilogy or part 1 of a 4 game, which is Trails of Cold Steel. But I just heard nothing but great. It's like the From Software people that are just really in it, and like giving their impressions. Like they're just so excited about it. I see that in this audience as well, just talking about this endlessly. That these games are really, really good and they are meant for the hardcore JRPG fan.
Yeah, and I mean, when we say a hardcore JRPG fan, it doesn't mean these games are difficult, because I think that
they're not difficult,
especially if you played the PS4 and PC versions like you talked about, Garrett. There's a lot of features that help newcomers jump into these games. So even if you don't if you don't want the combat to be too difficult, you can play the game on easy, and it actually is like really easy then. So you don't have to worry about it too much. So I actually think it's actually, like, to your point, I think it's probably a good place to start, which brings in a question that I wanted to save here. This comes to us from Kevin Ainsworth at the Muffin Mon on Twitter, who asks the question: as someone that hasn't tried any Nihon Falcom RPGs, which series would you recommend he starts with? The E series or the Trail series, and if so, which game? So obviously, if you were going to start with the Trail series, I'm in agreement with Garrett where you should start with Trails of Cold Steel if you're going to go down that route. And likewise, if you're going to start with Ease, I think you're good to start with either Ease 8 or Ease 9 and just go from there. Because I think both those games are really good, and I think they're both good for newcomers. But if I had to choose which one is probably going to be a little more beginner friendly, I think it is probably the ease games, simply because, again, I think it is less of a time commitment to go back and play those games, combined with the fact that I think the games are just generally shorter. But beyond that, I think the combat in the ease games are much more similar to just an action RPG that you would play normal, like a Western RPG or something like that. Even they don't go that far in that direction, but it's closer to something like you said, like the Tales series, which I think is actually like a lot more approachable than the tactical combat that you find in the Trails series. So if I had to say, Kevin, which series you should start with, I would say probably the Ease series because of that. And again, I would start with like Ease 8 or Ease 9, depending on which one's on sale, or play them both. I mean, you buy them both. But Garrett, what do you think about this question?
Well, I think, with Kevin, I actually saw his messages on Discord, and he's been playing Monarch as well and really, really enjoying it, at least in our Discord, which is fantastic to see. I'm glad he's enjoying it. And so if you do like that gameplay, if you do like the kind of turn-based but also free-range combat, I think Trails of Cold Steel executes it much better than Monarch. I think it does a really good job of really just the combo between all the companions together. There's a lot of systems behind just the placement of certain soldiers and their classes. There's a like Xenoblade Chronicles. There's just a lot of lines going back and forth between enemies and friendly units. I did enjoy all the battles that I played in Trails of Cold Steel. So yeah, I mean, if you really want to get into a franchise and you love that combat, I would definitely recommend Trails of Cold Steel. I would recommend either playing on PS4 or on Steam. If you have a Vita and if you want to go out there and grab a physical copy or buy it digitally, go for it. It's not like a bad version. It's just you won't be able to fast forward in a lot of different places.
Yeah, because the Vita version was essentially a port of the PS3 and PSP version. So it just doesn't have a lot of the benefit of a lot of the extra features they put in the PS4 version.
For sure. But I do agree with you, Ryan. For anyone out there that wants to get into these franchises, I would totally recommend the Yeast series first. I think it's more approachable, especially action RPG oriented. It's a lot of mashing buttons and it's really fun, flashy animations. And I think people would be really familiar as like with the Tales series. It's just like going through that formula. And it really is like I would say a carbon copy, but like if I gave a Yeast game, like a later Yeast game and a later Tales game to a non-RPG, non-gamer, they probably wouldn't tell the difference. Yeah, really. Exactly. It's really that close. So yeah, there you go. That's my impressions of the franchises there.
Also, one thing I want to throw out there as well, and this comes back to the E series as well, is if you're unsure about, whether you should buy them right away, both E's 8 and 9 have demos on both PS4 and Switch. So you can try them there as well. And I think one of the later Trails of Cold Steel games has a demo. But then so you can maybe get a sense of the combat, I guess, but obviously you don't want to dip too far into the story if you're going to, go through the whole series. But that's another way, to figure out if these games are for you, if you don't want to, if you're unsure whether or not to plunk down some of the money for some of these games. Although the Ease games, I'm not going to lie, they go on sale all the time. Like right now while we're talking, all the time. Like Ease 8, for example, is $20 on PS4. So there's that.
That's just an easy entry right there. Yeah. I remember getting it on Switch and I'm like, this is, and it's, you get a lot of value out of it, for sure. Trails of Cold Steel, it goes on sale quite often. I've seen 1 and 2 go as low as like $20 each as well.
Not only that, but I think to throw a wrench into your whole suggestion, Garrett, they have Trails of Cold Steel on PlayStation now, but it's the PS3 version.
Oh no. You're going to have to stream it in like, no, that's probably not a good version to go.
No, probably not the way you want to go with that, but it is there. It's an option if you want to go down that route. But so at this point then, what I wanted to kind of talk about to kind of round out our conversation then. First of all, Garrett, thank you so much for putting together the fun facts, even though we went all out. You went so all out with the fun facts. We're like 45 minutes into this show.
I'm sorry. I wanted to get. Let me tell you.
It's okay. I love how detailed you went with them. So totally cool. But
it's a major company.
I just noticed that. I was like, holy crap, we've been recording for 45 minutes now. But no, the thing I want to talk about, just looking at the list of games now that the company does, at this point, they're really just, the House of Ease and Legend of Heroes, and they don't really make anything else at this point. Like the last game that they had that wasn't, a Legend of Heroes game or Ys game was Tokyo Xanadu, which came out in 2015. But beyond that, like the last game that they had before that, it wasn't in any of those two series, was 2009's Brandish, the Dark Revenant on the PSP.
And we didn't even mention Brandish, but that's one of their other major franchises as well.
Yeah.
So
what I'm getting at is like, do you think that they're going to continue to make Legend of Heroes games and Ys games forever? Or do you ever think they're going to like branch off and maybe make a new franchise of some kind or do something else, or maybe even like return to some of their older games? Because as you alluded to, Garrett, they have a lot of franchises that are kind of just sitting there that they don't make games for anymore. So what do you think about that? Where do you think the future lies for Nihon Falcom?
I don't know, man. They're so elusive. They're really just beating the drum on the Ys and the Trail series right now. And I think until, people are getting bored of this or sales are dipping down out of our small base here, we're going to have to spin off to something else. I think they're just going to keep at it, Ryan. I think it's just, they are comfortable at what they do. And it's very easy to tell with all of their sequels and spin-offs that they've done for the past 40 years. 37 years ever since their first action RPG. It's kind of crazy to think about. I think they're just, and as their founder said, like they're story driven first. Like if they ever release a new franchise, it's not because of the new graphics or whatever. It's just going to be, they want to tell a new story.
Right.
And they want to have a brand new kind of lore behind that. And of course, what they anticipate from that is multiple sequels and multiple generations of those sequels. I think they're just beating the beat of their own drum and they don't care. They are not out there to be successful or to be huge as, their counterparts there, their competitors did in Japan. They're just not like that at all. So they're just going to keep on doing what they're doing.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that's what I'm kind of expecting, but I don't know. I would love, and we talked about this one on the From Software episode, but I always get a little bit sad when we talk about some of these companies and they're really just laser focused on one or two franchises when a lot of times we see that because, it was so much easier to develop, games on the PC or, early NES and Super Famicom kind of days where you didn't need like giant teams or, billions of dollars to develop games. You got to see a lot more experimentation with games or just see them try a bunch of ideas. Like, again, looking at their library of games that they worked on over the years, it's just so interesting. It's such an interesting contrast looking at their first 20 years and how many different types of experiences they had versus kind of the last 15 years of what they've done essentially, where it's such a stark contrast between each other. So I would love to see them kind of branch out and do other stuff. I know that's not their style and, they're probably not going to do that, but I would love to see what other ideas they have and maybe what other universes they could tell stories in and do so much. Cause they do, like you said, Garrett, they focus so much on the story that I almost wish they were willing to take more risk with stories or do something completely different with a lot of their stories. But also the Legend of Heroes universe does have a lot of room to play in because again, the Trails of Cold Steel games, for example, are a lot different than Trails of the Sky because they take place in different locations and stuff like that too. So that does play into it a little bit, but I don't know. I guess that's just one of the rants that you could probably expect from someone like me when we see stuff like this, especially at least they're not as bad as, when we were talking about Monolith Soft that only makes Xenoblade Chronicles and nothing else at this point.
And just only Xenoblade Chronicles.
Yeah. So.
They're making their third one this year. Can't wait, but oh boy. Yeah. We sort of predicted that one.
It wasn't really hard to predict that one, Garrett.
Yeah.
Oh boy. But I don't know. I think that was a good conversation, but we should bring in some listener questions, Garrett, because we reached out to the community and asked them what they wanted to know about Nihon Falcom. And we're going to start with Matt Sawinski from the PlayStation Drive over at Burnout Matt on Twitter, he asked the question, what does the Trails series need to do to take it to the next level, like Tales of Arise did last year? And I think the answer to this, actually, Andrew Semichek on Twitter stole my answer for this because he basically kind of replied to Matt about this. But I think they need to totally don't get me wrong. They kind of do almost like a franchise reboot in a way when they go to like a different offshoot of the series, like when they get outside, the Trails of Cold Steel games, for example, like with some of these other games, they have a different feel to them, but I think they need to do like a complete overhaul to the combat system and maybe make it more refined and whatnot. I think that's more what they need to do, or just Nihon Falcom games for all the things that we like about them. The one thing that they will always get dinged on in reviews is their visuals. And I think a lot of that comes down to, how many people work at these studios. Like obviously there aren't nearly as many people at Nihon Falcom today as there are even working at just the mainline Tales studio at Bandai Namco, because Bandai Namco is just such a bigger company.
Right.
But it's just one of those things where what I think really makes the Tales games, for example, stand apart is they work with companies like UFO Table to help them with the animation process. And they have like really fantastic in-game art and character models and whatnot. And the environments just feel, so much more interesting to explore versus, the Trails of games. Because even though I think, Nihon Falcom does the best they can with them, they're just that one step behind their competitors when it comes to that stuff, which again harkens to what Matt's kind of asking about. So that's what I think. I think they really just need to, even if they don't reinvent the wheel with the combat, I think they just need to, try and maybe expand a little bit and try and do some more with the visuals for some of these games. But Garrett, what do you think about this?
Oh, well, I definitely agree with you, Ryan. They definitely need some sort of level up with the graphics department. They can't really do much more than they already have with like their manpower. So I kind of want to suggest some sort of like different art style, maybe like a HT 2D version, maybe to like cut out some time, maybe even just go back to a 2D art style, kind of mess around if they can even go back into those type of games. I understand they've been out of it for quite some time, but like if they keep going with this, I don't know, the 3D art graphics, it was fine during the PSP and the Vita version or eras, but now with even PC and PS4 and even on Switch, it just doesn't look, it looks pretty dated. It doesn't look quite as good. Even like the Yeast series looks really good compared to the Trail series. So I'm wondering if they just need to leverage a little bit more, I don't know, like fluidity and like a little bit just more touch up on their character models or whatever. I would just suggest that it would be nice to have a Tales of Arise type of reboot of some kind. That'd be really cool to see, and just like get rid of the Switch and like go for it. But I just don't think they have the capacity to do that. They'll have to outsource that if they really want to do a bigger project.
Well, the funny thing about what you were talking about, Garrett, is that with Ys 9 in particular, they almost kind of dig that, which is why that game looks so good, because with the Switch, I don't know if you remember this, but when the Switch version of Ys 9 came out, like it ran awfully on Switch. It ran at like 20 frames per second. Like they had to throw in a bunch of patches to fix that game. And now it actually runs fine on Switch, but it's still like, it runs way better. It looks way better on PlayStation 4. So like it almost felt like the Switch was kind of like an afterthought for that game in particular. So I'm really interested to see where they go from here, what their next new games are. Because again, these two new Trails of games that we have coming out this year are ports that had already come out already. So these aren't really new entries. Right. So like, I wonder what their next new experience is really going to look like. Because I think that's maybe where it needs the most work. But next up, we got Brew at Brew Pounder on Twitter, who asked the question. And Garrett, you'll probably have more to say about this one maybe than me, but Sara Valestein or Claire Rieveldt from the Trail series, which do we prefer? Do we have a favorite between these two characters, Garrett?
I'm looking this tweet up real quick. Because he did attach photos, which thank you, Brew Pounder, for for doing that, so we can have
I was
a good
say,
comparison between the two.
I remember looking at the photos and was reminded of this. I'm going with Claire. You know, she's
oh, you're going with Claire.
Stylish. Okay. She's got the blue hair. I mean, come on.
Got the blue hair going.
What else
okay,
do you need
sounds good. Sarah Valestein was, I think she was like, yeah, she was the first teacher of the Trails of Cold Steel, and she's dope. She is just like a super like powerful personality, very confident. I really enjoyed Sara a lot in that game. So yeah, I'm just gonna go with Sara. Thank you for Brew for that question.
For sure. Now, we also got 2 other questions this week, Garrett, that have literally nothing to do with Nihon Falcom, but we're gonna go through them anyways. Because I did, we always put out the poll, like if people want to ask, you know, generic RPG questions as well, we'll definitely take those as well and answer them. Such as from DJ Cox at Delvin Cox on Twitter. We know him. He asked the question, what RPGs do you both recommend for people who aren't into RPGs to try? So one of the ones we've talked about not too long ago, Garrett, was Tales of Arise. I think that's one that is, you know,
that's a big
really
one,
approachable for newcomers, especially like when we got Sean to play that game, who's not really super into RPGs, and just about he came away loving that game. I think that's actually like a really good game, RPG that like it will get people into RPGs that don't really like RPGs already. Even though just like I think another one is Fire Emblem. I mean, if you like, you know, strategy games at all outside of like role-playing games themselves, then I think, you know, a game like Fire Emblem Awakening, for example, will be up your alley. Like it's super beginner friendly and it's just an amazing game on top of that. So those are kind of my 2. And of course, you know, Final Fantasy's out there as well. It's fairly mainstream. And I do think there's a lot of entry points there, even though, you know, there's 15 mainline entries in Final Fantasy, and it's almost like just like, where the heck do you start with Final Fantasy? But because all the games are kind of one-off games, you can almost start with any one of them. And I would say at that point, try Final Fantasy VII Remake, because it might be up your alley as well. And I do think that one's also, you know, really good for newcomers in the same way that something like, you know, Tales of Arise was. So those are kind of my 3 picks for you, Delvin. But Garrett, what do you think about Delvin's question?
All right, well, I'm going to add a little bit on the turn-based area. I actually recommend, out of all the Pokemon games right now, if you would told me what game should you choose, I think I recommend Pokemon Legends Arceus. That game got me hooked on Pokemon again. And I it's actually unbelievable. It's like reinvigorated my love for the Pokemon franchise. And it is very close to, let's say, it's like a Monster Hunter formula kind of just mixed in with Pokemon together and just made this wonderful game. It's very open world. Yes, of course, the graphics department, not that great.
Yep.
Draw distance is like very, very small.
Although, Garrett, you say this, but literally I was playing Elden Ring this week on Xbox Series X, and it literally did the same thing that Legends Arceus did with like grass popping and stuff like that, except it's on Xbox Series X of all consoles. So just saying, you know, I think there's, you know, maybe that's more common than we think. Maybe it's just not a Pokemon Legends Arceus thing.
Yeah, so I definitely recommend that. I also, you know, if you're really more into the turn-based stuff and you're itching for a really long game, I mean, Persona 5 Royal, man, that's one of the pinnacle. And if you're at least like going into it, let's say 20 hours, I think that's really satisfying of a turn-based game, at least going through a couple of dungeons, not going through like, you know, all the 150 hours that you can in that game.
Yeah.
Definitely recommend that. And also, of course, I will always recommend this Skyrim. It is literally everywhere. You can play it on your fridge, Delvin. You can play it on Amazon Alexa if you want. You could probably play it on your watch somewhere. So it's in crossplay, you know, cross progression everywhere. So
I mean, Garrett, they also have Elder Scrolls on the N-Gage. So if you've got an N-Gage lying around,
oh goodness,
that's 2 N-Gage references in one episode. This episode's clearly cursed.
I couldn't believe it.
But also go play Elden Ring. That game's really good as well. So last question of the week comes to us from Dave Brooks at Dave Brooks with 2 V's at the end. I don't know how that works. I hope I pronounced that correctly. He asked the question, what is the deal with LX2? look forward to your siege-like answers. So, Garrett, do you know anything about LX2? Because I didn't before this question came in.
I've seen Alex, the game title, sparingly on my PlayStation Plus and on my sales all the time. Who is this made by? Is it made by Spiders?
It's
or
made
is it
by Piranha Bytes. They made the
Piranha
Gothic
Bytes,
games and the Risen games.
Yeah, so that's another niche franchise that makes off these lower tier. You could say they are the B tier kind of mid tier type of development. But I don't know. I don't know what's the deal with ELX2. Do you know what the deal with ELX2 is, Ryan?
I mean, it came out this year, and people seem to think it's okay. But no, I mean, I don't really like the other games that this developer makes, so I was just not like, chomping at the bit to play this one, if that makes any sense. But we also didn't talk about it in our like games of of the year for RPGs when we did kind of our like year-long preview, just because for whatever reason this just missed my radar of game releases this year, or it probably just wasn't on the list that I used to kind of put that show together. So I did miss that one, but I can tell you, Garrett, I don't know if you saw this week because I'm going off on a tangent with this one.
Go for it, man.
Did you see the Metacritic rating reviews for Atelier Sophie 2 that came out this week? That game's apparently really good.
Yeah. So I that's on my fantasy league.
PSVG, man. So I was debating
good.
picking it with Sean this year when we did our trophy room versus the Xbox Drive, but we didn't end up going with it. I'm kicking myself now for not going with it.
Yeah,
that game apparently
it's a pretty good one. Mm-hmm.
It's like one of the highest rated Atelier games. It's like only behind, Atelier Ryza 2, essentially.
They're really nailing it lately with these Atelier games, man. They're, I think they nailed down a formula just like the Tales with Tales of Arise. The Atelier Ryza 2, and now Sophie 2, it's doing pretty good.
Yeah,
so,
I think their turning point was with Fairy Tale, I think was kind of the turning point. Yeah. Like that was like the game from them that I saw that when looking at reviews, like it's the first one to really get in kind of like the mid-tier 80s, and then they've been on a roll ever since, I think. So it's pretty cool to see Gust actually coming out there and doing some cool stuff. So I had to bring that up too, because of course, it came out the same week as Elden Ring, but no one is giving Atelier Sophie 2, the time of day. But we're going to do that, Garrett, because we'll talk about it here, even though neither of us have played it. We'll at least mention it and give it a shout out. Whereas LX2, unfortunately, I'm sorry, Dave, I just haven't really figured any information out. And I saw this question came in a little bit late, so I just didn't have time to look into it much, unfortunately.
Right. Well, I just feel like, we can go into these, in an episode, these RPG franchises that you would never, ever talk about unless you're really into the gaming verse. Like I'm talking, what's the other one that I'm thinking of that's pretty good, made by Spiders? Oh man, it's the Colonial game that they made. Oh gosh, it's gonna really rage. A Spider game on. I'm looking at it.
While you look it up, I will say, eventually we got to talk about the Lufia games. We got to talk about, Illusion of Gaia. Yeah. We got to talk about, Potful Mail. We got to talk about all kinds of weird franchises that, we wouldn't hear many shows talking about at some point.
Right. Yeah. The Spiders made Sherlock Holmes. Greedfall. That's it. Greedfall. They made Technomancer as well. And so they're also, I think, that B tier, mid tier development type of art. I mean, they make other games, but they do make RPGs. And I heard Greedfall was pretty good.
It was on PlayStation Plus for a while. So most people probably have it, and they just never actually opened it or tried it. But anyways, Garrett, that's probably it for the show. Now that we're in the weeds a bit, we should probably wrap this up. But before we go, Garrett, let's go.
You can follow me at Twitter at Bland Explosion. And then you can also find me at the Nintendo Shack, which is a Nintendo podcast, part of the Play Some Video Games Podcast Network. And we're released, on Spotify, YouTube, Apple, everywhere. And we're live Thursday nights weekly at twitch.tv/PSVG.
Very nice, my friend. As for me, you can find me on Twitter at Ryan Turford. You can find us on Twitter at Yumi Capri's, on YouTube at youtube.com/Yumi Capri, and on podcast services around the globe. So, For Garret Planned, I am Ryan Turford. This has been level 37 of the RPG Cave, and we're out.
Bye-bye.
The RPG Cave's mana is powered by patrons over at patreon.com/YumiCapri. And from the bottom of my heart, I want to say thank you to our over 70 patrons, starting with our Capremium producers, Dallas Ford, Jonathan Brown, the man behind the music on the Xbox Drive and the Nintendo Drive. You can check out his new album, In My Element, over on Apple Music, as well as his website, and Lee Navarro, the fearless leader of the Phoenix Overdrive Extra Life team. Our platinum producers are Robbie Bobby Miller and Trucker Sloth, and our gold members, Argo, Brandon Myers, Dallas Robbins, Dano, Emily O'Kelly, Foolish Fuji, Joel Brooks, Jose Jimenez, Mac Time, Marcus O'Neill, Mr. and Mrs. Nasty Boots, RJ Kern, Skinny Matt, Tony Baker, and Xavier Reyes. Thank you all for all of your support, and if you're interested in joining the Patreon, head over to patreon.com/YumiCapri and pick the tier that's right for you.